The following is a conversation with Graham Harman. He's one of the top 50 living philosophers alive, according to many sources. And his philosophy specifically is quite interesting. It's called object-oriented ontology. It was something, quite frankly, which I've never heard before I met him. And it basically says everything has a value. No matter how big, how small it is in the world, everything kind of has a value in its own existence. And this kind of philosophical premise really has a lot of conclusions down the road and has a lot of implications as well down the road, And yeah, it was an incredibly interesting discussion. It's a discussion, on this podcast, I like to kind of get the smartest people in the room and discuss life, discuss how they look at life, what they're doing, how they're kind of looking at the stuff that's going on in the world. And this is certainly that today. So without further ado, Graham Harman. All right, Graham, good to have you on the show. To kick things off, in a world full of AI, social media, quick answers, and everything being kind of right at your fingertips, what pulls someone back to philosophy? How to cut through all the noise to really find the real meaning in daily life?
Well, for my generation, we began philosophy before AI was even existing in any sort of form. You're talking about the new generation, I suppose. For me, philosophy is about, people often say wonder. Aristotle, Heidegger to some extent says something like that. For me, I'm willing to just call it surprise because I don't think there's any priority of being surprised by the whole, which wonder and angst seem to imply, that somehow being surprised about the fact that there's something rather than nothing is somehow a higher form of wonderment than any other. I don't think there is a whole. And so I think surprise tends to be focused on individual issues or topics. Let's face it, most of us have 90% cliches in our head. We don't have original thoughts about much, right? We are socialized into thinking certain things. We belong to one political group or another, haven't always thought things through. And so it's fairly rare that we actually get a new independent idea about something that grabs us. That, for me, is what philosophy is about. It's about, the Greeks always contrasted philosophy with doxa, with opinion. And there's this lingering belief some have that doxa, opinion, is countered with knowledge. And I don't think that's the case. I think doxa is countered usually by a sense of paradox or a sense of uncertainty. So for me, it's about finding things that don't quite work or where the inherited view on something isn't quite right somehow. There's a crack in it that no one has noticed. And it has to fascinate you in a way that you really put your neck on the line and try to find some way of reacting to that crack in the world that's your own.
Mm-hmm.
And this might involve a bit of courage. People might ridicule you for certain things. I've not had the easiest time with Heidegger scholars, but I've never stopped thinking my reading of Heidegger was a good one. So you have to stick to your guns. But it has to be sincere. You have to really see something there and not just be trying to be a contrarian or to poke people in the eye. It has to be something you genuinely care about.
Mm-hmm. And how has that helped you personally? Because for me, it's quite interesting, speaking to someone who's, done this his whole life, right? You've been basically all over the world, from beautiful Egypt to many places in the States, right? You've been pretty much kind of doing that stuff everywhere. How do you personally apply this to your own life? How is there maybe like an example how this helped you in good times, in bad times, in mediocre times? I don't know. Do you, as a philosopher, I would say, are you able to kind of use these mental models also for your own kind of daily life, or is it more of an abstraction away from it that is actually harder to kind of grasp in the real world? That makes sense.
Any real philosophy is going to change how you see the world. And so you can't really separate it from everything going on. I mean, one of the things that I think scientists don't get about us is that we're never off the clock. We're never off the job. My wife's a scientist, and these are very smart people. But there's more of a tendency to, when you're home, it's leisure time, right? The work is done in the lab or in the office. Whereas philosophy, you're never really off the job. The ideas can come at any time. They weigh on every aspect of your life sometimes. And so sometimes we can get a bit absent-minded and not be fully in the present because we're thinking about some idea or the idea pops up. And for me in particular, aesthetics is an extremely important part of philosophy. For me, it's the root of philosophy. Maybe we'll get into that. But George Santayana, the Spanish-American philosopher, late 19th century, early 20th century, wrote a book called The Sense of Beauty. And he made a point early in that book that has always stuck with me, which is that beauty is a fairly minor part of philosophy, but it's a major part of everyday life. We are constantly making aesthetic decisions. You and I were talking about what to do with the background here on my camera. That's an aesthetic decision. The aesthetics of summer mornings here in Long Beach, California, they're always very gray. Looks like it's going to rain, and then in a couple of hours it'll be sunny. That affects your mood as it makes an transition every day. You're choosing clothes, you're choosing haircuts, you're choosing cars, everything by aesthetic principles. And yet somehow that's considered as not quite the rigorous sort of philosophy that we get with metaphysics or the theory of knowledge or logic. And so an aesthetic approach to the world is also something that is always on my mind. I'm always looking for things that stand out from an otherwise mediocre set of surroundings. And maybe that's how I ended up in an architecture school of all places. I joke that I had to go all the way to Egypt for my first job and all the way to architecture for my second. I've never been in a philosophy department in North America, and probably never will be at this point. But it's because I follow these aesthetic intuitions of places that are interesting. Egypt, I'd never been to that part of the world. Changed my life. Architecture, I knew nothing about it, but I've had to learn fast. It's not often that in midlife you're compelled to learn a new discipline on the fly, but that's what an architecture school has done for me.
And I fully agree with you. For me, I code a lot, software development, and there's really, the more you do it, the more you start to see the beauty in this. And the more you kind of go from, okay, you do this to do X, to make money, to do whatever, but it's really about, you produce something that is kind of closed in itself and really beautiful in itself also. And for me, this is really the one place where I have it, where I can build something, it works, it's kind of beautiful for me. When most people would look at it and they wouldn't see anything, but for me, I look at it and that's kind of what I see. Is this the same for you with architecture, or what's the closest thing for you on that regard?
Well, I wasn't sure what to make of architecture when I first got into it, because when you're in a new discipline, you're hearing conversations and they make no sense. You can't tell which statements are mainstream, which statements are a little more daring, and so you have to get oriented. It takes a while. The learning curve is very steep. And for reasons I've written about, I think architecture is the genre that most challenges the recent history of aesthetics, most challenges Kantian aesthetics, namely. But my friend David Rue, who teaches here with me at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, made the point that architecture is our first contact with reality, in the sense that we are almost never in pristine virginal nature. And even if we are, there's signs, there are some paths, we often have GPS in some format available to us. And so really, most of the time we're facing an artificial environment, whether it's in a city or simply in a house. And so that is why architecture has become so important to me and why I keep studying it. Of course, I sort of have to because I'm at the school, but being around architects all the time gives me a certain familiarity with recent developments in the field.
And probably, honestly, these skill sets we'll be able to use also in the digital age a lot, I think, because now what I see, it really goes more and more digital. I mean, I don't understand it, but some people really already live in the goggles, right? And they seem to love it. And also there, I mean, for now, it looks mostly a bit sad. I don't know, when you're in this world. I tried it once with this Meta Quest something, I don't know. But it's gonna get better. And I think really this aesthetics kind of piece is gonna get more and more important, honestly. Because I agree with you. It's the world we live in, and it's what we see every single day. It's the first thing you see when you go out of the house, usually, right?
I remember back to graduate school roughly 30 years ago. Life then was completely different what life is now. I mean, the web was already there, but we went to travel agents to buy tickets still. A little before that, you had to actually go to a bookstore and look at the books in print catalog and write out the book number to order it and wait a couple of weeks. Now you just get everything from Amazon usually. You can get an electronic book in seconds. But the reason I say this is because I think 30 years from now, things will be even more different compared to today than today is to 30 years ago. And of course, the virtual world is one of those factors, and the other one is AI. And yes, I think once it gets better, it will be more palatable. And you see in architecture, that, well, for one thing, a lot of humanists around the world are simply angry about ChatGPT and other bots like that, because we primarily see it as something students are using to cheat, and that's there. I can't really assign term papers anymore. I just have an in-class exam and then a final oral exam, just so I can know who's really studied. But teaching in an architecture school, I have a different view on this, because architecture students are encouraged to use AI in their studio classes because it's a basic tool of the discipline now. I know back in the 90s, were the first paperless studios. Bernard Tschumi at Columbia University in New York was the first to have his students not use any paper. There was no need to anymore. Some of the old timers then were saying, oh, you're not doing real architecture if you're not using your hands. And now there are some maybe saying you're not doing real architecture if you're using AI, but it gives the students a real power to design incredible things. And you can still judge the students, right? There are better and worse ways to use Midjourney and other AI software for architecture. Also, I should say that one of our most popular programs now for students is called Fiction and Entertainment. And it involves students who want to do architecture either in a Hollywood film context or in a video game context. Again, some of our faculty don't like that. They want to focus only on the built environment with physical stuff. I tend to be more of the mind that that's the direction architecture is going. It's much cheaper, much more flexible to have us inhabit virtual environments, and eventually they'll be good enough that it's a satisfying experience. We're still in the early days. And video games may be frowned upon as a arts wannabe or some form of something that's not quite art, but people love playing video games. They love spending time in that environment, and there's going to be more and more of that. So I find that academics, even though in the humanities, even though they tend to consider themselves politically progressive, are almost always technological reactionaries. They are almost always looking first at the downside of a new technology, and that they're not going to be able to stop. So maybe there's some rare case coming up where we can lobby against the technology, like killer drones, maybe the landmines. There can be protests against these sort of things, but academics in the humanities tend to have a more reflexive negative reaction of resistance to anything that's going to change the world they know. And in this case, of course, the position of university professor might not exist too much longer in the form we know it. It's going to be radically different, I think, once students can learn reliably from AI. I mean, there's something important about the face-to-face thing of two humans, but that's going to take a different form than lecturing to a class of 20 or 30 students. So we're on the verge of big changes, and whether they're bad or not isn't the question. We're just going to have to adapt to some of them. We're not going to be able to stop. There are too many advantages to these technologies. We can't shut them down.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I can speak from kind of the computer science perspective. That's kind of what philosophy and architecture is for you. That's it for me, right? And I was actually lucky. I was one of the very last that kind of graduated without any of the AI. I mean, I remember taking the AI classes back then, and the craziest AI we had was image classifiers. Is it a cat or a dog? So that was quite far from what we have today. And I'm not sure if I'm glad or if I'm sad about it, because on the one hand, everything I'm using these days, like technologically speaking, I learned myself. With YouTube, with ChatGPT, I literally talk to it. Imagine I drive in the car and I have a chat about super random topics. Actually, even for this conversations, I learned so much about your teachings with ChatGPT. That's probably, only if you would have taught me directly, I could have learned even more, maybe. But even that, with ChatGPT, there's no stupid questions. Like I can be a complete idiot, and it's gonna tell me, yeah, you're doing good. You're doing quite all right. So on the one side, there's that, and on the other side, I'm also kind of glad that I was able to learn and study I don't want to say real way. I just want to say the legacy way, whatever that means, because it helped me develop the brain quite a bit. And now I feel like this is kind of the best of both worlds, where I had to use the brain, quite intensely in some cases, in other subjects a bit less, but in some really, it was not so easy. And this now together with AI, where I had this brain training and I can use that really inside of AI. It's for me personally the most incredible transformation of my life so far. Really, like the boost I'm getting. I have like 3 or 4 or 5, maybe even 10 Enricos working behind me every single day, and they just work, and that opens up a lot of questions, philosophical questions, honestly. I see so many great arguments. I see so many horrible arguments or bad arguments, negative arguments. And I don't know, I could really argue both sides. And I would be very interested to kind of hear your thoughts. I already hear that you're more on the, I don't know what to call it, open-minded side of let's embrace it and let's really work with it and then let's use it smartly. How do you think about this? How do you maybe your colleagues think about this? How do your students think about this? And yeah, what's kind of the vibe in the university these days? I'm curious.
I think there are more people like me at SciArc because it's always fancied itself, and with some justice, as an avant-garde architectural school where they're always exploring new things. Several of my colleagues are graduates of Columbia during Bernard Tschumi's time, the first paperless studio. I think that left a deep impression on them about the need to innovate. And I've already heard an idea out there in the podcast sphere that I agree with, which is that what's going to really happen with AI, at least at first, is that it's going to be intellectually polarizing in the sense, on the one side, you're going to have the stereotypical lazy student who's cheating. And I don't think that can go on for long because I think the academic world will adapt to that and make that impossible somehow. But on the other hand, you've got people who are already pretty educated and are using it as a force multiplier intellectually. I love using ChatGPT. I usually ask it a couple of questions a day. And you have to know enough to know when it's just bullshitting. Because one of the questions I asked it once for fun was, rank all of my books from best to worst. I wanted to see what it would say. And it gave a list. The problem is it missed about 4 of my books. It included 2 that were written by other people, and it made up 2 titles of books that don't even exist. But what I found is that you can scold it and say, come on now, you missed 4 of my books, and you included 2 fictitious ones and 2 by other people. Do a better job. And then it did it, and it still had a couple of mistakes. And then a second scold was enough to get it right. It had all of my books. It ranked them and gave reasons for the ranking. I asked it also, all of my friends who are authors, I went through and asked, assess this person's personality based only on their publications. And again, it made a couple of howler mistakes about people's personalities, but the depth of insight on the stuff it got right, including about me, was incredible. And the nuance it's capable of. And then also I will just ask it counterfactual questions from history, like imagine that Napoleon had been a general in the Second World War. What would his strategy have been against the Nazi blitzkrieg? And it was excellent. It said, based on his strategies during his actual career, he probably would have fortified the Ardennes region, and he also probably would have tried to convince the British military to join him in a preemptive strike on the Rhineland. It does sound like something Napoleon would have done. And so it gets you thinking. I also asked, let's say there's the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, which we hope never happens. I said, give me a 1-year scenario of how this unfolds, how it's responded to. And it gave me this really long and by no means rosy picture of what happened. What it said was that, yes, there will be retaliation by NATO, conventional retaliation against the Russian forces, and Russia would eventually fail in that effort, except the long-term consequences would be horrible because lots of countries then would start racing towards tactical nuclear weapons in particular. And it got me thinking about that and just having a plausible scenario to chew on. You try to invent that yourself, it would take more knowledge than you probably have on any given topic, and it would probably take hours of research or months or years. This way you get at least something somewhat plausible in a couple of seconds. And the problem, of course, is students who don't have any pre-existing base of knowledge to draw on might not be able to take certain things with a grain of salt and to accept other things more. And so, as my friend John Cogburn was saying, maybe AI is best for people who didn't grow up on AI. Maybe the real risk will be for people who have always had it. However, I want to say one last thing, which is, I think one of the main arguments against AI is just false, and I'm in the minority here. One of the main arguments is humans won't be creating anything anymore. We'll just be having the computer do it for us. I don't think humans are essentially creators. I think humans are essentially connoisseurs. The book I recently finished, Waves and Stones, it's about the continuous and the discrete and the strife between those two in many different human fields. People ask me why I wrote that. The reason I wrote it is because I wanted to read it, but there was no such book that I know of. I was looking for books on that topic, and I couldn't really find one that covered multiple disciplines. So I kind of had to write it just because no one had written it for me. Let's say let me back up a step. Medium term, I think writing will be something done by human AI teams. And people will say, oh, that's cheating. Well, at first, that's why I won't be an early adopter. I don't want to have people pointing the finger at me and saying, you use ChatGPT. No, I think maybe 20 years down the line, maybe sooner, I would love it if I could have told ChatGPT, write 20 drafts for me of a book on the continuous and the discrete in the style of my previous books. Then I read those, I pick the best one and start modifying it. That would be an incredible time saver. And it wouldn't have taken me nearly as long to write this book. Now, one of the problems, I think, is there's going to be a glut of junk books. It's going to be so easy to write books. And so there's going to have to be a much higher level of criticism, of quality control. And so humans are still going to be in the position of connoisseurs. And I think that's what we are naturally. I think we create stuff simply because we have to in order to judge it or in order to separate the best from the worst. The act of creation is not essential. I'll give one story here. There was a woman artist in New York in the early 60s whose name is slipping my mind. It's very embarrassing. She was not a sculptor, but she created assemblages and out of wood and things like that. And the risk she took is that she was the first to simply plan what it should look like, and then she hired a bunch of carpenters to make it. And so you had people saying, she's not a real artist, right? She's cheating. She's hiring other people to do it. Well, I think now we've reached the point where we see having the idea for what it looks like should be fine. What's the big deal if you hire a carpenter? I mean, Michelangelo had people in his workshop doing stuff for him. I visited the studio of an important sculptor today, and he had people doing the sculptures for him. I think the idea is what we associate with the artist now. So I think connoisseurship is what humans are really about. We judge things better or worse than others. So that's where I think we're headed, towards a world of connoisseurship.
And I agree with you. The way I like to think of it, we're like the captain of the AI, and we have to navigate it, and we have to really use the different things and then put them together. And I think this the human will always do. And there also, once again, I agree with you again, where we will invent many, 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 many more things that way than the legacy way, just because, I mean, I don't know, for example, if they can figure out however many billions of combinations in protein folding within a couple of days, right? That's just a much kind of broader selection to choose from in the first place. And kind of this logic you can apply to anything, I think. And that's how I use it too, honestly. That's how, literally how I prepare this podcast. I have exactly what you just described. I let AI, I brainstorm kind of 5 different directions with AI, pick the one I like the best, work on this one maybe 1 or 2 days, really together with AI, and then I challenge it. I say, but what about this? What if you do that? And so on. And what comes out of it, quite frankly, is just so much better than if I would be alone. And our little silly monkey brains are just much stronger with some help here. And for me personally, I'm gladly taking that help, because I really see the huge difference from my output before, creatively speaking, but also just in sheer numbers. It's something I would never, ever, ever, ever give back, honestly. Never.
It's incredible. And at first, my main complaint was that the sense of humor of ChatGPT was horrible. It told only corny jokes. Like if you ask me to tell a joke, the jokes are awful. But there's a workaround that I discovered, which is that if you ask it to pretend it's some famous comedian and do a routine in the style of that comedian, then it's brilliant. So I've been asking it. I asked it to do a routine in the style of Dennis Miller about my school, SciArc, and the stuff it was saying about our school was hilarious. So it can do that. It's capable of a lot of things if you know how to create the right prompts.
That's how I do my birthday cards these days. I create jokes for my friends, and then I send it over, happy birthday. And then it's always a good laugh, and then very unique, actually, very unique.
My brother, who's a huge fan of the first 2 Godfather films, but hates Godfather 3, had to go through a sequence of making Godfather 4, which is even worse, and Godfather 5, which is even worse. And it was incredible. It was like Godfather 4, I think, was a cook-off between all the characters, like a cooking contest. Godfather 5 was a musical. And then by Godfather 18, it was so awful that cinema was banned as a genre because it was so offensive. I won't even say what happened in the film, but yes, it's capable of a lot of things. And again, you have to have an eye for mistakes. And they're the environmental concerns people talk about. And I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, how much water is required to cool the chips or whatnot. And this is why I don't use it more than I do. I'll use it once or twice a day until I learn more about the true environmental impact of this. But It's the most exciting tool I've had in a while, for stimulating my imagination, thinking about things I wouldn't otherwise have thought of. So yes, I'm not on the side of my fellow humanities professors here. I'm much more optimistic. Now, I should add, of course, there's always the chance that killer AI will destroy us all, extract metal from our bodies, and all of these nightmare scenarios. This is why someone needs to be studying this. And Nick Bostrom had that Center, the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, where they were studying all these things like asteroid strikes, pandemics, killer AI running away with stuff. He then became somewhat discredited because of some racist eugenic remarks that surfaced from the 1990s, and his center was closed at Oxford. I don't know if that's why. I suspect it might have been, but someone needs to be studying that kind of stuff, existential humanity from these technologies, because it could always happen. It's just I'm not really in a position at this point to judge those sorts of things. I don't have the scientific knowledge I would need. I stay somewhat abreast of climate change, but I don't have the climate science knowledge that many people have, where they can really figure out what the risks are. But other than that, I'm more optimistic about the future of technologies.
Well, the beautiful thing about the AI is what's expensive is the training. When you actually use ChatGPT, you can relax. You'll be fine, ecologically speaking, at least, because it's basically just putting your text through the function, and that's actually a, comparatively cheap operation. So the training is really what costs billions in money, but also in CO2 and whatever other metric.
Right.
But yeah, this is quite. The training of ChatGPT is insanely expensive. Like, both on the money side and on the how much data centers they need, and also just the human effort to not make it say, well, sorry for the word, shit that it shouldn't do. It should really not say certain things, because as you know, it's being trained with the internet, and in the internet you find pretty great things, but also pretty stupid things. Let's be honest, right? And pretty racist things and pretty whatever. So there's a lot of effort going in there of actually making it safe. But the ecological footprint, when you use it, it's compared to the training, it's you can use it more than 2 or 3 times a day, and you will be fine, I think. Well,
that's reassuring. That's the first news I had on that front. Of course, Elon Musk's Grok has been the prime culprit in saying bad things to people. What did it say?
Exactly right. Yeah.
There was the question recently: who would be the right person to handle which leader from history would be the right person to handle the floods in Texas? And it said Adolf Hitler. He'd do the right thing every damn time.
Yeah.
It was on Grok.
That was unfortunate, I would say.
Very.
That's a very good example of what not to do.
Right.
And you know what they did, actually? They removed 2 or 3 sentences from the so-called system prompt, which basically just let it speak. Well, they tried to make it more freely, but they obviously went into a completely wrong direction. And it's actually crazy what 2 or 3 sentences in the prompting of this AI could kind of prevent down the road. But at the same time, honestly, if you know what you're doing with ChatGPT, even you or anyone, you can really get it to say things it shouldn't, always. Even now with the safety measures, you will find a way how to get that headline. Of course, in that case, it was kind of the worst possible headline for Grok AI, right? I think it doesn't get any worse. But I think this is all just kind of minor cosmetical damages, because the real damage that I'm really worried about, actually, as a computer scientist, as someone who's been working with that basically my whole life, honestly, like that's been a default working mode for me since 4, 5, 6 years, right? Is really that if it gets much better, just if you extrapolate that progress into infinity, into the future, the probability of someone effing up is quite high, whether it's a company or one person. At some point, these models will be so strong that it will be quite easy for the everyday person, you and me, to really do our own thing with that model. And with there will be open source models doing these things. And I don't know. In my head, I always think kind of in worst case scenarios. And for me, kind of logically, it makes sense. If you extrapolate this, let's say, into infinity, and you assume even just if one person really messes up, that can cause quite a big bump in our world history. I'm not sure, how to look at this. How do you look at this?
Yes, I think there's a problem there. And I think in general, we're drifting towards more authoritarian models of government, at least on some fronts. And I'm not always opposed to these. I'm against authoritarianism in general. But for instance, with the pandemic, I was in favor of government restrictions for the most part. And of course, the American right was always complaining about this, but this is a public health issue, right? And so I somehow at times understood what China was doing with their very draconian policies, because obviously you have rights in a democracy, but you don't have a right to infect 100 people and kill 10 of them. This has been, I think, common sense since Louis Pasteur, at least. So I think some forms of authoritarianism are going to have to occur in that sense. And then there's going to be gray areas, questions like virtual reality. Let's say virtual reality is so good you can do anything you want, and somebody decides they want to be a serial rapist and murderer in virtual worlds. On the one hand, you could say, well, nobody's really being hurt. But on the other hand, do we want to be surrounded by people where that's their recreation? So it's kind of a more intense version of the debate over pornography, which some people oppose. They think it dehumanizes women. Well, imagine VR people are committing actual crimes and it feels realistic. There are going to be all kinds of situations like that, trying to decide how we police virtual actions, or should we police them at all. But let's hope that the basics of democracy can somehow get through. There may have to be a few concessions based on truly dangerous technologies and truly dangerous behaviors. So I don't want to get to the point where Singapore is, where people are whipped for spray painting graffiti. But for things like the pandemic, I'm somewhat more in favor of regulation, let's say.
My point was less about the human aspect of it, because yes, bad people are going to do bad things, whether it's in the real world or in the digital world. They're going to find a way, that's just unfortunately the way it is. What I'm more worried is that these AI tools are really, they're getting more and more agent support, like tool support, where they can basically call external sources. Like, I don't know, they can do a Google call, they can do a call to another AI, they can call your database, they can do pretty much everything. That's right now already in place, And I don't know, just if I think about this and if I extrapolate this into a couple of years or a couple of decades, the probability of an AI agent accidentally having access to a certain tool that it shouldn't, doing a certain thing that it shouldn't, this for me in my head is almost guaranteed, unfortunately, just because one person will make a mistake, whether it's at Google or OpenAI or whatever, Grok. It's going to happen because we're human. They're going to press the wrong button, or they're going to give it the wrong tool or the wrong admin rights or whatever. And this is what I'm really worried about, that then you kind of have this self-controlling mechanism that really has access to a lot of things, and that we humans didn't program it well enough to actually be able to stop it,
That's going to happen. Let's hope it starts on a small scale.
Yeah.
Maybe it creates a local incident rather than a global massacre or something.
Yeah.
So that we have time to rethink this stuff. And we're also just going to have huge data overload on all fronts. And then one other thing that people have talked about, we use Siri already on the iPhone for directions sometimes, and it still makes mistakes. Like, it tries to send me through fences and things sometimes, or tries to get me to turn off a bridge when it's impossible, like in the middle of a bridge. Now, my wife gets really angry and starts shouting at it. Now, some people have warned that you better not do that, because maybe in 50 years, Siri is armed with deadly weapons and holds a grudge for something you said to it 40 or 50 years ago. It'd be a big mistake. So I try to be careful with these machines and be kind to them.
I mean, most AI providers, they say they don't collect any data and they don't train their model on your data, but quite frankly, I just don't believe them, because there's too much money in it not to do it, Like,
right.
It's kind of the logical business decision. So yeah, I agree with you. I am kind of conservatively careful with my AIs, how I speak to it, how I do it. Probably nothing's going to happen, and probably I'm too small of a fish to even matter in the big wheel of our world, But still, it's just better to be friendly, I think.
And I refuse to buy Alexa, as cool as it is. I don't want an open mic in my house. You never know how that could be used. There was already, Apple's being sued for the iPhone, listening to conversations. You might have heard this, that some men were in their car talking about life insurance, and then suddenly they get spammed with a lot of life insurance emails. It seems to have been Apple's fault. And there's all kinds of cases of unauthorized data sales. So my highway toll company is being sued for selling our data on our driving habits to other companies. So people are not following the laws or regulations on these things.
Yeah, that's the scariest thing, because this is really true, actually. Apple or the smartphones do listen, because sometimes, and it's certainly not a coincidence, because that would be too much of a coincidence. Sometimes you really speak about something, whatever it might be. Let's go to holidays to Mykonos, and next second on Instagram you'll get an ad on how to book it. And this is, I mean, okay, it's great on the one hand because yes, it saves you a click, but it's also just bad and illegal. I don't know. The negatives clearly outweigh the positives here, in my opinion. Clearly.
Even Amazon's recommendations of books, it recommends to me either things I already own or things I'd love to own. So it's a very good piece of software, whatever that is. But yes, in a way it's creepy that it's processing my information like that. Because ultimately we're all more predictable than we think we are. And so I don't like the fact that perhaps an Amazon piece of software knows me better than I know myself. It's unnerving.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in a way, it's a good segue, because what I would like to do next with you is really deconstruct, well, I would say your main topic, correct me if I'm wrong, object-oriented ontology, right? A couple of weeks ago, the only object-oriented I knew was programming. So there's object-oriented programming, but what you're doing is completely different. So I would like for you to quickly kind of describe, really for the mainstream audience, or try to like explain it like I'm five, like I have no idea about the whole thing. Just assume that for a second. And after you've explained that, if you could also explain how you kind of see this object in conjunction with AI, like what do you make of all of that? This would be a very interesting insight for me.
Well, first I should confess that I stole the metaphor object-oriented shamelessly from computer science.
Oh, well, there you go.
I was in graduate school, and when I visit my parents, there were object-oriented books sitting around the house because my dad is a kind of tech guy. And so I browsed through those books, and I agreed philosophically with what it was saying about encapsulation and being able to move a piece of software from one context to another, and black boxing and all of these things. So that's where I got the metaphor from. What it's about is the fact that a thing is not reducible to its relations. And you might say, well, who would think that? Well, a lot of philosophers think that a thing is nothing more than what it does to other things. My friend and advisor, Bruno, who unfortunately died a few years ago, had a discipline he called actor network theory, where you're looking at every entity in terms of how it acts on other entities. There's no surplus in the objects other than the things that it does. Well, I'm enough of a classicist, enough of an Aristotelian, that I don't agree with that. I believe that things are autonomous. They're capable of more uses than they currently have, so they're not reducible to their uses. They're also more than their pieces are, right? There's an emergence in objects over and above their pieces. And so let me back up a second. I think there are really only two kinds of knowledge in the world. I call them undermining and overmining. If someone asks you what something is, you can tell them what it's made of, or you can tell them what it does. That's really the only two kinds of knowledge that exist. And I've looked for a counterexample. I haven't found one in years. So someone asks me what some chemical is, I can either tell them what atoms it has in it, or I can tell them its medical uses. Okay, but what you're missing in that case is the object itself. You're reducing the object to a kind of knowledge, right? You're reducing it either to what we know about its composition or what we know about its effects in the world. And I've tried to explain why neither of those is sufficient. Okay, so then how can you talk about a thing without reducing it to some form of knowledge? Well, you've got to have a kind of counter-knowledge that is nonetheless not useless. Some philosophers will say, well, if you can't say anything definite about our knowledge about a thing, then what's the point of talking about it? You can't say anything about it. Well, that's what Socrates was already fighting against in ancient Greece. Philosophia does not mean wisdom, it means love of wisdom. The first part of the word means love, the second part means wisdom. The point being that humans are not gods. We're also not dogs. We're somewhere in between. We have some awareness conceptually of the things around us, but we'll never get a total conceptual awareness. Another way I put this is literalism always fails. Literalism is a way of trying to explain a thing either by talking about what it's made of or talking about the qualities it possesses. And so to know a thing would be to have a piece of paper that wrote down all of that contained all the qualities that it truly possesses. I counter that an object is not just a bundle of qualities. An object is a unity that unites those qualities in a specific way that is different from any other objects. The French philosopher Merleau-Ponty once wrote the brilliant sentence that the black of an ink pen and the black of an executioner's hood are not the same black, even if they are both the same exact wavelength of light, because the object to which a quality belongs really colors and inflects that quality. So for me, what philosophy is really about, it's about anti-literalism, and anti-literalism is about driving a wedge between an object and its qualities. to not think that an object is just a bundle of qualities, the way David Hume thought. And this already brings you into the realm of aesthetics, right? Because there's no direct, literal, conceptual way, discursive way to fully exhaust what a thing is by listing all the possible knowledge there is of it. It's always going to be a kind of partial awareness. And some people will say, well, that's negative theology, referring to the theology of the Middle Ages where you could only say what God is not what God is. And that's not the case. If you go back and read Pseudo-Dionysius from the Middle Ages, the apparent founder of negative theology, you'll find that his theology is not just negative, it's metaphorical. To give you an example, there's a passage where he's trying to explain the Trinity, key concept of Christianity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And he didn't convince me to believe in the Trinity, but it's by far the best explanation I've ever seen, and it's metaphorical. Pseudo-Dionysius says, imagine a house that has 3 lamps, but those 3 lamps combine into one light, and you can't tell which part of the light comes from which of the 3 lamps. I think that's a brilliant metaphor for how the Trinity might work. So instead of just saying it's a logical contradiction, the metaphor enables you to consider it from the standpoint of a believing Christian and see what Pseudo-Dionysius has in mind. And so in other words, I think a huge part of human cognition is not knowledge. I think the idea that everything is either knowledge or it's worthless is a modern prejudice. It comes from the triumph of modern physics, perhaps the most important discovery in human history, or at least in recent human history, which has made our lives so much easier in terms of medical and scientific advances, and has also made our life much more dangerous in terms of the chemicals it produces, the atomic weapons it has produced. But I think there's this huge landscape of cognitions that are usually belittled in that environment. And aesthetic skill is one of them. Taste, like the taste of a wine critic, is another. Rhetoric is something that in the modern period has been dismissed as mere rhetoric, as though the whole point of rhetoric is to try to trick people into believing illogical things using emotions. Well, that's certainly not how the ancients saw it. Plato might have seen it that way, but that's not how Aristotle and Cicero and Demosthenes saw it. They saw that rhetoric was about persuading people using things that are not explicitly stated, right? That there's that level of discourse, there's the things we say, and then there are the things that are either assumed or implied or insinuated that in some ways are much more powerful. So the example that Aristotle gives is that if in ancient Greece, someone is giving a speech and says, but this man has been 3 times crowned with laurel, we have no idea what that means, but in ancient Greece, they all know it means he won the Olympics 3 times. But it's more powerful to say poetically he has been 3 times crowned with laurel, knowing that everyone in ancient Greece understands what that means. My second trip to Europe, I flew from London back to the U.S., and this was only a couple of years after that Pan Am airliner exploded over Scotland, killing everyone on board, unfortunately. And so the British security guy was there asking me questions, asking me if I had accepted any gifts, and asked various questions about gifts, and I said no. And he simply said, you understand why I'm asking these questions? And I simply nodded subtly. That was a much more powerful interaction than if he had said, you realize there was a bombing 2 years ago. Spelling it all out would have kind of dampened the force of our conversation. Sometimes implying things is better. Look at jokes. If somebody spells out a joke, it's ruined usually. So a joke I saw once that was somewhat popular in Belgium, there are 3 kinds of people, those who can count and those who can't. Okay, not that funny, but it's pretty good. And if there were a child near you who said, Daddy, I don't get it, and you had to explain, you'd say, well, see, they said there were 3 kinds of people, but they only listed 2. And since one of the 2 was people who can't count, they're unconsciously inscribing themselves in that category. Okay, the child now maybe understands, but you've ruined the joke as joke. Threats. The Godfather, I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse, is much scarier than I'm going to cut off his horse's head and put it in his bed at night. Or the first Gulf War, a horrible threat made by Dick Cheney to Iraq when there was a rumor that Iraq might use chemical weapons against U.S. soldiers. Cheney's response to Iraq was, if Iraq uses chemical weapons, the United States will respond promptly and decisively in a manner from which it will take Iraq centuries to recover, which is far scarier than saying, if you use chemical weapons, we'll use nuclear weapons. An insinuation is always much darker and much more powerful. And I think we need to open up more respect for this sort of indirect kind of cognition that the modern emphasis on scientific explicit knowledge is incapable of appreciating. even in the philosophy of science, of course, we have Popper, who discovered, I would say, that scientific statements usually work best when they amount to a falsification rather than a verification of existing theories. So negating something. And so science, in a way, is not about getting closer to the truth. It's about getting away from the mistakes of past theories. See, it's always a constant movement away. So anyway, I could go on about that forever. I'll stop and let you get in here.
So, but if you really have to boil it down, because I think that was now a very academic approach to the whole topic. I followed, and it was very interesting, actually. And you could please, next time you can go on for many hours like this. Actually, I would love to listen to it, honestly. But if you really have to boil it down in one or two sentences, what would that exactly entail? I can try to do it, and you can try to correct me if that helps. Yeah. So basically, the way I understand it is that just everything around us is an object, and it doesn't matter if I appreciate it or not. It's going to be there, and it's living like its completely own life. That's like, for me, my best try at saying what this is about. How accurate is that, or how far away from the truth am I here?
In some ways, that's better than the summary I gave, so thank you.
Okay. I'm going to copyright that then.
Okay, yes. You're right. I forgot that I was speaking to a general podcast here. My fault. The first thing it means is, everything's an object. And that includes human beings. A lot of times people distinguish between object and subject. That's a trope of modern philosophy. And that leads them to think that humans are utterly different in kind from everything else in the cosmos, which, first of all, is extremely improbable. Yes, we are humans, and so we care more about humans. And yes, humans have intelligence that other things around us don't seem to have at that level. Who knows how we stack up with possible alien species? But I wanted to start at a more general level. So everything that exists can be called an object. And what defines an object? An object is a unified thing that is not reducible downward to its parts or upward to its effects. And so you can name objects that are not real objects, right? Like you can just name 4 random objects like Tabasco sauce plus Zurich plus Manchester United plus Mars. Okay, I just arbitrarily posited an object. There's no reason to think that exists, because there's no reason to think those things are unified in a way that has a surplus greater than its parts and less than its effects. It's simply something that I stipulated to exist in my mind. And those exist for me too. Those are called sensual objects. They exist only for some observer. So a lot of fictional objects start out that way, at least. A real object is one that exists as a unit, regardless of whether anything is interacting with it or not. So that's the first principle, I guess. Yes. And unlike many philosophers, object-oriented ontology does not privilege natural objects over artificial ones. So a philosopher like Leibniz would say anything that exists by nature is a substance, and anything that exists artificially is what he calls an aggregate. So Leibniz makes fun of examples like a circle of men holding hands. That's not a real thing. Or 2 diamonds glued together, he says, or all the officers of the Dutch East India Company. He would have said an airplane if he had lived to see them. Whereas I say, why is an airplane not a real object? It is for me, because an airplane has features that none of its parts have, right? You can't fly with any of the parts of an airplane, not even with the wings. You need the pieces assembled. Nor is an airplane reducible to the uses we know of, because there might be other uses for it, right? So that's the first thing, is that anything that's unified, whether naturally or artificially, can be considered a real object. And the next step is that real objects always hide to some extent. And I didn't invent that. That's a big theme in Heidegger's philosophy. That's even a big theme in Kant's philosophy already, when he talks about the thing in itself, that the real objects hide from us. Any knowledge we have of them is going to be, to some extent, a caricature. It's not going to be a complete picture. And you can see this precisely from the advance of science, that science is always learning more about things, which means there's always a surplus we've never quite mastered. There are always new and better theories not yet discovered. So objects hide from us. But probably the big step in object-oriented ontology that shocks a lot of people is that objects do this to each other as well. And that is something that has been a taboo since pre-Kantian philosophy, because Kant really started this idea in modern Western philosophy. You can't really talk about the things. You can only talk about the human relation to things. You could talk about how the human mind structures experience. You can't talk about the way things really are, because the way things really are, they might exist in 7 spatial dimensions rather than 3, and our minds are too weak to know it. Or maybe objects are capable of going backwards in time. Or maybe objects don't have cause and effect relations, and that cause and effect relations only exist for human experience. So I'm trying to, in some way, say, no, actually, Kant's right about the things in themselves, I think, but he's not right that we can only talk about the human experience of other things. Because the example I always use from medieval Islamic philosophy is, what if fire is burning cotton? Well, obviously, the fire is not interacting with all the properties of the cotton. It's interacting only with the flammable ones, whereas humans are capable of detecting other features in the cotton, and mosquitoes maybe others, raindrops others. People don't like this because they think I'm saying all these things are conscious, right? That I'm trying to claim that fire and cotton are conscious. And yes, panpsychism, the idea that everything has a mind, is becoming more popular in the philosophy of mind now, but I'm not a panpsychist because I don't think you need a mind to distort the reality of something else, right? Yes, the human mind means we only see things in spatial temporal terms and we see everything as happening by laws of cause and effect. Kant was right about that. But it's not true that fire, just because, let's say fire is not conscious, I don't believe it is, it doesn't mean that fire has a direct relation with cotton simply because it doesn't have a mind. The fact is, any two things in relation are not going to relate to all the aspects of each other. They're going to react to an oversimplified caricature of each other.
Uh-huh.
And so that's really the central theme of object-oriented ontology. And that's the one that mainstream philosophers are most appalled by, I would say, because they're orienting themselves still by Kant, who was a great philosopher. But, it's been 240 some years since the critique of 244 years since the critique of pure reason was published. We might want to think about some other alternatives, because philosophy has gotten stuck in a kind of academic swamp where the Kantian presuppositions rule everything.
Now, what's the antagonist to kind of this mental framework? Is it that the human is in the center and we are all that matters, and this is kind of the central theme, or how would you describe that?
That's the strategic antagonist, and that is modern philosophy. Modern philosophy is about this turn, so that human thought is the first step. And this starts with Descartes' idea that I think, therefore I am. Even if everything I see is a hallucination, I know that I have to be here so that I can hallucinate. So the first thing we have certainty of is ourselves. Well, that's not really true, because we don't really understand ourselves better than we understand anything else. Why does psychoanalysis and psychotherapy exist? Because we're often very confused about our own desires and motivations. So yes, in a relative sense, I know myself better than you know me. I know more facts about myself than you do, and vice versa. But I don't really understand myself in an absolute sense any more than you understand me. So that's the main antagonist. Other antagonists are, right now in the continental tradition of philosophy, people are big on this idea that everything's changing all the time, everything's in flux, nothing stays the same for even an instant, and so forth. This goes back to Heraclitus in ancient Greece and to some more recent figures like Bergson and Giordano. But I give various arguments for why that doesn't work in my new book. And then another enemy, more of a friendly enemy, is the late Bruno Latour's philosophy I mentioned, actor network theory, where he tries to reduce everything to its relations. And that's a very powerful method. You can learn a lot about the world by insisting that somebody specify exactly what object they're talking about and exactly what it's doing. This allowed Latour to dispose of notions like society with a capital S. Like if someone says, society makes us think such and such, Latour says, what's society? Which specific entities are enforcing these supposed dictates of society? Or science with a capital S. Latour wants to look at the exact workings of a specific scientific paper or experiment. Or a big one today, capitalism with a capital C. Latour is suspicious of the example of capitalism. That's a controversial one, but I tend to agree with him. People say capitalism sometimes without really being specific about what they mean. Or today they say neoliberalism because it sounds less cliche, but they're basically meaning more or less the same thing. So I agree with Latour that you need to look at individual agents and what they are doing before you appeal to these giant abstractions with capital letters. Where I disagreed with Latour always to the end of his life was the idea that a thing is only what it does. And because things are often not doing anything at all, or they're often not performing their full range of functions, or we don't always understand their full range of functions. So that's another thing we look at in object-oriented ontology, is what is a thing not currently doing that is still part of its reality? So these are some of the features. I don't know if that's still too academic or if that helped advance.
That was perfect, actually. For me, that a lot of insights there that made the picture even clearer, because quite frankly, this is a hard topic to get into at the very first, because I understand for you, obviously you've been doing this for, 20 plus years, right? Or even more, I guess. But if you actually think about this for the very first time, it's a bit abstract at first, but then it's also poetic, I think, because it kind of shows you, okay, we are here, you are here, it is here, AI is here, everything is here. And for me, it kind of helps. Everything matters, but everything also doesn't matter in a way. And we're not the center of the universe. And for me, this is a helpful thought, honestly, because it kind of makes everything relative. On the good side, the bad things. On the bad side, the good things. So that's kind of in a way another mental framework of mine actually is really this Stoicism. For me, this kind of shows in not caring too much about stuff around you cannot control, not caring too much about the bad things, not caring too much about the good things. This is kind of a parallel I saw. I would be curious if you also see that parallel or not. And for me, the main thing is that I really saw it's great to kind of remove the bad things, from the world, because you just say, hey, I can't control it, or hey, it's there anyway and I cannot do anything. But also it takes away a bit of the joy, And I wonder how do you, what would you say back to this? Do you think it's more of a net positive, more of a net negative, more of a nothing in between? Like how do you see that, if you know what I mean?
Is what more of a net positive or negative? I want to make sure I know what the subject is here.
Well, object-oriented ontology and kind of the Stoicism, because for me, at least in my brain, it goes. I mean, there's parallels for sure, and I wonder how you look at that.
I'm actually inclined to take it in the other direction, because I'm inclined to think of Stoicism as an artificial separation of ourselves from the world, right? That I can't control it. I only control what's in my own mind. Whereas I would say more that object-oriented ontology encourages passion about things and enthusiasm and a willingness to take something seriously and undergo its loss later. So if there are those sorts of ethical implications, that's probably the direction I would take it. Stoicism certainly sometimes helps. In the case of things like AI, as we were discussing earlier, I guess it's sort of a Stoic attitude to say, look, I'm not going to be able to stop AI single-handedly. Why don't I try to find some use for it? Now, granted, that sort of argument has been used for controversial purposes. For instance, when Trump announced an architectural competition for his wall on the border of Mexico, some architects entered that competition and said, well, he's going to build a wall anyway, so we might as well make a nice one. And that came under a lot of fire, obviously, from other architects and other people in the media. But I don't think AI is quite at the level of the wall in Mexico. It's more of an ambiguous, or ambivalent, I should say, technology where there will be good and bad uses. Just as with automobiles. I mean, we can't imagine our lives without cars right now, but it contributes so much to CO2. It also, United States, 30,000 people a year die in car accidents. I guess we consider that an acceptable risk. Any of us could die in a car accident, but we're not going to scrap the technology just for that reason. Maybe we try to replace it with a safer one someday, but for now, we're willing to take the 30,000 fatalities per year.
And what would be the one or two things you really see? What can people apply in their own life? If they're listening now and if they say, okay, new concept I learned today sounds great, but how can I apply this in my life? What are one or two or three things that are really practical where you can say, hey, think about it in this term or think about it in that one? And yeah.
The first one is be alert to surprises. Be alert to your expectations not being met. Usually there's this defense mechanism among humans that they want to say, I knew it all along, I knew this would happen. Usually there's something about what happened that is not what you expected. It's good to focus on where your predictions go wrong, where your expectations go wrong. Often, for example, before you go to a party, you have certain expectations. You're either looking forward to the party or not looking forward to it. But then parties always turn out to be a little different from what you expect. Or places that you travel to. I'm very interested in travel. And I would always very assiduously read travel guides about the places I went to. But then it was never really like the place I went to, because there's smells that that can't be described in the guidebook. There are certain streets have wind blowing in your face. There are certain shortcuts the guidebook didn't tell you about. Learning how to navigate my way around a city was always my favorite thing. And the guidebooks were always a bit off. They can tell you some basic facts. Like before I moved to Cairo, I read the whole Cairo Lonely Planet guide. And it was helpful in telling me certain things to do and not to do, but it was never quite like what I thought. It's like reading a description of a painting. Imagine that you read a book about Paul Cézanne's painting, but it had no illustrations in it. How hard it would be if you'd never seen Cézanne to imagine just based on descriptions, there would be a difference. And I think we're running out of time, but I'll give this one example, counterexample that some people...
We have as much time as we need. Don't worry about it at all. Like, there's no upper limit here. We can rock and roll here for 10 hours, which might be a bit long, but we can.
Some philosophers don't agree with what I just said about Cézanne's paintings never being exactly as they're described. In philosophy of mind, there's this famous thought experiment called the myth of Mary that was invented by Frank Jackson, the Australian philosopher, where it's imagining this woman named Mary, who is the world's greatest neuroscientist. She understands absolutely everything about how the brain works. In my philosophy, that's not possible anyway, but let's assume that it were. And for some reason, she's been growing up underground. She's never left an underground room in which everything is black or white. She's never seen a color. Yet she knows everything. She's read about colors, and she knows everything about how the brain works. She's simply never seen a color. And so the thought experiment, it's kind of like Plato's cave. Take Mary out of her underground prison and bring her up to the world and show her a red apple. The question is, has she learned anything from seeing the red apple? And for me, it's obvious that she has, right? Whatever descriptions she read and whatever rods and cones are being activated in the eye, to me, it's obvious she's had a new experience, whereas there's a large contingent of philosophers who say she hasn't learned anything because they believe knowing the neural subcomponents that allow us to see color and knowing functionally how people behave when they see red is enough to explain what red is. There's no quality of red that's something separate from its underlying conditions or the behavior to which it leads. I disagree with that. Anyway, you asked me about the things that people could bring into their everyday life. The first one is be alert for surprises. Also, take aesthetic questions more seriously. Realize that aesthetic questions have the same cognitive dignity as purely formal, logical, and scientific questions. It's an area of the human cognitive map that knowledge can't really cover because by definition, things like rhetoric and things like illusion and innuendo are not forms of knowledge. And people will say, yeah, but how are you going to use innuendo in science? Well, you're not, because that's not what science does, right? Science is primarily about knowledge. But things like hints and hidden properties, implications, all of these things are a huge part of our cognitive landscape. Even the people who claim to be rationalist kingpins who only use logic and reason use rhetorical strategies all the time. And they also have emotional underpinnings to their thoughts as well. There's often a kind of sadistic wish to take away other people's religious belief or to take away other people's belief in colors. So there's often quite as much an emotional motivation in those cases as there is for others. So we need a much wider map of human cognition than we currently have. And going along with that, we need a much better picture of plant, animal, maybe even fungus cognition. I've always said that one way we'll know if philosophy made progress in the 21st century is if we have a better model of plant and animal cognition than we had coming into the century. Because modern philosophy, even ancient philosophy, is simply not very good at this. Aristotle's De Anima on the Soul, it's a classic work. But what he tells us about different creatures is basically plants can feed themselves, animals can also perceive, humans can also think. All right, but that's the most commonsensical division between those you can ever imagine. In modern philosophy, it gets even worse. Descartes thinks that you're either a full-blown human thinker or you're just a machine. And so a monkey can be tortured with a knife and scream. It doesn't really matter. It's just like a machine that needs more oil. It's not really feeling anything. Heidegger makes a very common sense distinction between humans who form world, animals that are poor in world, and stones that have no worlds. My friend Quandaries makes a similar distinction between matter, life, and thought. None of these are nuanced enough to do justice, for instance, to the difference between a crow and a cockroach, or between a snake and an amoeba. We need to come up with better philosophical tools to do this. Now, some people will say cognitive ethology already does this in the sciences. It already studies exactly what it's like for different animals to perceive. Yes, and it's very interesting to read the works of the cognitive ethologist. I was just reading one a couple weeks ago. But the philosophical discourse on things is always different from the scientific discourse on the same thing because philosophy is not primarily about knowledge. It's doing a different sort of thing. You could have a philosophy of nature. That's not really allowed anymore since Kant, right? The natural sciences are given a monopoly on talking about nature. And if you start talking about nature philosophically the way the German Romantics did, it sounds kind of crackpot, mad scientist sort of thing. But that's not the only way to do it. There are ways to talk about nature using specifically philosophical concepts that talk about the same things as science does without completely overlapping in its results or in its questions. So we need to get rid of this modern idea that scientists talk about nature and philosophers can only talk about the relation between the human mind and the world. Epistemological problem. No, philosophers can also talk about nature as we can talk about arts and anything else, and our results will not be the same as the scientists. So these are some of the things I think you could take away. The world is a more mysterious place than you realize, that we constantly need to be focusing on what we get wrong rather than what we got right in our expectations of the future, that we need to be a little more attentive to what animals and even plants can do that we're not aware of. And philosophy of plants is becoming a big research area, by the way, in the last few decades. So a lot of nice surprises await us in the 21st century of philosophy. And Kant is a great philosopher, and I think his insight into the things in themselves that we cannot know simply needs to be expanded into the idea that objects can't fully grasp each other either. And we need to get out of the Kantian idea that philosophy is all about the human-world relation, because we can also talk about object-object relations. So these are the reasons I'm excited about philosophy every morning when I wake up, and why I'm willing to take shots and slings and arrows from people who don't like what I'm doing, because I'm grasping this topic and I know it's real. And that's what life is about. Ultimately, you have to place your bets somewhere, and there has to be enough evidence that you're not just making a random bet on something. But why do certain people bank their entire lives on a specific research program, even if it's surrounded by opponents and hecklers? Well, it's because ultimately, thought is a matter of fidelity. Alain Badiou today has said that. Michael Polanyi, the philosopher of science who's no longer alive, said that there's a fiduciary character to truth. Ultimately, we're not going to have enough evidence in our lifetimes to know what's true and what's not. Kierkegaard, another philosopher who said this. Kierkegaard said, you're never going to be able to reach an informed decision about whether Hegel's philosophy is correct in a totally satisfactory way. At some point, you're going to have to decide whether to become a Christian or not in his case, and he became a Christian. Other people might make other choices. We have different reasons for making these choices, but there's a certain aspect of seizing on something and committing yourself to it without ever quite having adequate evidence.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, because for me, the biggest insight was when I really started to think about this, is that there's tremendous beauty in everyday objects, and it's actually a choice how you feel about it when you walk out of the street and you smell beautiful smell, hopefully, if you're in nature and you see the beautiful greeneries and the lakes and whatever, or a beautiful city. And really, it's a choice what you see in that. And that's what really resonated with me, where the things exist and they exist anyway, with or without you. So might as well look at the bright side of things, in these things. So for me, this was actually very, very, very helpful in just in everyday thinking, in everyday living. And what I try to do, I listen to everyone, whether it's, physicists, computer scientists, philosophers, and I just try to kind of go through these things myself. Some things get stuck, like in a good way, they stay there, others don't. But I think this, especially philosophy, is incredibly helpful for that, because, and I don't know, that let's say, I don't know if it's the right word, but let's say the hard sciences, like where it's okay, right or wrong, like physics or whatever, they are very primitive in a way. Computer science too, like there's a way to do this and another way to do that. But with philosophy, it's completely open. So for me, it's like almost the next level, of thinking. Once you thought a lot about computer science, a lot about physics, a lot about many other topics, this is kind of where my mind goes to. And it's always incredibly interesting, to kind of hear this firsthand, how you see this, how you would explain it, because it's one thing reading about something, listening about something, but then interacting with it, So for me, this was very, very nice.
The life of a podcaster is a good one. The people you get to talk to, wonderful.
I couldn't agree more. So to wrap things up, what's your favorite kind of mental framework, mental model, or whatever you want to call it? I'm sure there's a word for it, from a different philosopher that is not you. Like, is there a theory or whatever it's called, I don't know, that you really resonate with, even if you say, actually, I would have loved to kind of figure this out myself, but the other guy already figured it out before me?
I'll give two answers here. The first is that my favorite philosopher is Leibniz. And we do have some things in common. He believes in individual substances. He doesn't agree with me that artificial things are real, so we have a disagreement about that. The other thing I like about Leibniz is that his great philosophical works are all very short, 10 to 15 pages. And so you can literally go to a cafe for 4 hours and read the major works of Leibniz. And it's a delight because they're so concentrated. You're confronted with these very basic and, for me, persuasive philosophical principles in most cases. So I really enjoy that. The other one I got from ChatGPT. Here's a fun thing to try if you have enough publications out there. I asked ChatGPT, which person in human history would Graham Harman get along with best? And I was so flattered by the answer. The answer was Giordano Bruno, the Italian philosopher and cosmologist who was burned at the stake in 1600. Because what I love about Bruno is his philosophical gambler's streak. Not only the ideas he would come up with, but the semi-comical way in which he would present them. For instance, he has a book called The Ash Wednesday Supper about going to Oxford to give a lecture defending Copernicus' system of astronomy. But he has all these great anecdotes about how various British villagers were beating him up on the way. So he's got this real comical sense and a sense of the meaning of everyday life for philosophy. And another one of my favorite books of Bruno, Cause, Principle, and Unity, there are two people having a serious philosophical debate, and then there's also this pedant speaking Latin all the time, and then there's a clown who makes fun of the pedant speaking Latin all the time. So not many philosophers would dare these sorts of comical genres for presenting their thoughts, but I would really love to have dinner with Giordano Bruno and see what he's like one-on-one. So he's another person who inspires me. And
Also,
go ahead.
Another thing I'm really curious about, because you're very eloquent, right? You can have very kind of complex discussions with people, and I'm pretty sure that most movies out there, they're just like completely not interesting, right? Because the monologue is or the dialogues are so incredibly stupid in sometimes, and just not interesting, right? For most people, for me included, honestly. I wonder, what is your favorite film? Actually, knowing everything you know, because I guess kind of architecture, aesthetics, it goes hand in hand with film, for me at least. Like for me, one of the greatest art forms is actually film, and really the movies, how they take you in, and they don't let you go, sometimes for 2 or 3 hours. And I would love to get your take on this. Like, what do you enjoy?
I'll start with Hollywood. It's The Godfather, just as my brother.
Good one.
I can watch it an infinite number of times, not get bored with it. Maybe intellectually a step up from that, Tarkovsky's Stalker is a movie I love. Even though you could argue the second half drags a bit, just such a fascinating premise, and also a fascinating philosophical idea. And I've never read the book version, so this may have been Stanislav Lem's idea rather than Tarkovsky's. Remember there's a room in the center of the zone that grants a wish. And apparently one of the reasons these soldiers are guarding the zone is because they're worried that someone's going to go in and wish for world domination. But as one of the characters points out, no, it has to be something you've really, truly wished for your entire life. And world domination is something people say to try to sound funny. But deep down, no one's desire is really world domination. Well, maybe Napoleon or Hitler, certain kind of person maybe. But for most of us, remember they say that when you're in the zone in that film, you have to think carefully, what is it you really wanted all your life? So it's kind of a question of Lacanian psychoanalysis. What's your desire, right? What is your desire? For me as a philosopher, I think my desire is to be an orator. And thank you for calling me eloquent, but I was the most tongue-tied and shy and anxious student all the way through. I didn't become a better speaker until I started teaching and discovered, to my great surprise, that I had a talent for explaining things clearly to students. And then that fed into my writing. And maybe that's why my desire has been to be an orator, in the sense that I would like to boil philosophical questions down to a simple enough form that I could make a speech about it and make things crystal clear to people as well as to myself, so that people would simply have to say, I see it. I see it. Not just that I agree, but I see it with my own eye. I think that's my desire as a philosopher, whether it's in writing or in speech, is to have a kind of oratorical approach.
Great. Thanks so much, really. We took, I think, a bit more time than we should have. I hope that was okay.
It's the longest podcast conversation I've ever had, but I've enjoyed every minute. So
likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao. Cheers.